It's a huge factor for your own perception of reality, meeting a different being.
The whole planet deserves to know the truth. You may be one of the few people who might be able to help us understand.
Species are brought together on a table and have diplomatic conversations
This
with
is
each other.
happening?
This is happening.
Where? Give an example. What happened with you?
This great being enters the room. It's a strong, crisp frequency that your body reacts to.
It's happening. It's happening behind the scenes. I mean, Tim, what is the true history of Earth?
I'm going to be talking about reptilians, the reptilian overlordship in general, and I will be talking about the inner dynamics of the reptilian experience as described by those who have gone through the experiences, myself included. What veteran investigators look for is what is known as pattern data correlations. Sometimes very nuanced, very obscure data points that are typically not known by the general public and often is not known by the mainstream UFO field. But these are data points that would be familiar to people who have gone through these experiences. A lot of what I'm going to describe has not been mentioned in the published literature, online or in books. Some of this stuff initially that I will bring up, some of you have heard before from if you followed my work and if you've listened to some of my lectures or listened to some of my interviews. So please bear with me initially, because for those who are not familiar with the subject matter, it's important for them to get a grounding, like a baseline understanding of the reptilians and their capabilities, which are quite interesting. I should point out, here's the disclaimer part, that some of the information I share will be very confronting. It's very confronting, and it can be very upsetting. This is my mentor, Barbara Bartholik. She passed away, and actually she died under very unusual circumstances, to say the least. She was my spiritual mama, and she, in my opinion, is the dean of alien abduction researchers. A lot of focus and attention has been given to people like David Jacobs and Bud Hopkins. But what Barbara has done is emphasize the reptilian aspect of alien abductions. She was particularly vocal about the energetic emotional harvesting aspect of alien abductions and reptilian abductions in particular. We are resonators. We're resonators of frequency. We're resonators of emotions. And it behooves these negative beings to keep us in the lower chakras of existence, to keep us in a low vibratory ebb. And it's a full spectrum dominance kind of assault via the mainstream media, via the fear-inducing media, via the so-called entertainment industry. All these things are designed to keep us in a state of high anxiety, doubt, hopelessness, so on and so forth. Within the context of the alien abduction experience and the reptilian abduction experience, it behooves these beings to keep us in a low vibratory ebb. And I will go into more detail about that as this lecture progresses. But that's a key point to remember at the outset: emotional, energetic harvesting. These negative beings are parasitical in nature. They feed off of emotions, negative emotions in particular. What are reptilians? There are essentially three kinds, if one wants to break it down. There are the extraterrestrial reptilians, who literally come here from other worlds within our cosmos, within our plane of existence. They come here in spaceships, or they can come here in stargates. There's also interdimensional reptilians who spend most of their time, if you will, and time is the most relative of concepts, in what David Icke would call the lower fourth dimension. They're essentially interdimensional. They exist beyond time. They have a number of ways to insinuate themselves and influence our physical 3D reality, which I'll get into. And another group of reptilians are subterrestrial. They have lived here all along. They reside in deep underground cavern systems. And there are, in truth, a number of civilizations beneath the surface of the earth, not just reptilians. And they live in these large underground cavern systems, and some of them are quite technologically adept. But they are not mutually exclusive. Some reptilians fall into all three categories. They're extraterrestrial, they've established underground installations, and they are also interdimensional, because some reptilians are masters of frequency and resonance. They can alter their density. They can be invisible in the visible spectrum, but they can still leave an impression of weight on a solid object like a mattress or a shag carpet or on a sofa. One cannot see them, or most people cannot see them, but they can see the weight that the entity is exerting on a surface. Now, we just saw somebody, Ellis, here give a lecture. Ellis is an example of someone who can see these entities. So that must be understood. When Ellis says, I saw a bunch of reptilians at the sporting event, he's talking about the entities overshadowing a host human, and I'll go into details about that. So, subterranean, extraterrestrial, interdimensional. Also, another reptilian is the infamous Draco, or the Dracs. These are the winged gargoyle species, which many people believe are at or near the top of the heap as far as the hierarchy is concerned. There is more than one type of reptilian. Some are greenish, some are dark, almost black, some are tannish, some are brown, some are pea soup green. Certain types of reptilians we call yellow bellies. They can vary in color, green, dark green, brownish, but their underside, very similar to surface reptilian creatures, their underside is light colored, tannish or whitish, and we call some of them yellow bellies. These are images I found online. I particularly like that image in the far left. I believe that was found in the one of the museums looted during the second annihilation of Iraq. The reptilian male there that is holding a scepter. Must be understood that in ancient times, the concept of scepters, of crowns, of thorns, of thrones rather, has been corrupted over time. In ancient times, paleo-ancient times, those were power tools. Like when you see depictions of Egyptian deities walking around with a big oversized ankh, those ankhs were power tools. They were able to open portals, they were able to manifest things. I will show you a sketch later of a reptilian holding a wand and describe some of that wand's capabilities. Architecture of control. Reptilians are the controlling factor. We reside within their sphere of influence. DNA is a currency of the universe. Within the DNA of many humans on the surface are latent metaphysical powers, for lack of a better term. And the deep black elements of the military aerospace community are aware of this and have been for a long time. There have always been priesthoods. We live in essentially a patriarchal system. And the powers that be know that within the DNA of certain people, certain hybrid bloodlines, because in truth, we are to one degree or another all hybrids. And some bloodlines have more of these latent metaphysical abilities than others. And these reptilians and other beings are able to access and exploit those metaphysical abilities. Reptilians don't need craft to travel in. They can open portals. Very commonplace, and we've heard these stories from antiquity, or they come out from under beds. They open portals in wardrobes, closets, if you will, as Americans would call it. A very common place for reptilians to enter into a house from is the stairwell beneath, like you have a set of stairs, and the space beneath the stairs, sometimes there's a storage area beneath within. That's a very common place for these entities to enter from. And they will leave some kind of residual traces of their entry and exit. When they come through these portals, through wardrobes that come through these portals in these stairwells. Very common residual traces would be like a brownish kind of liquid that's congealed onto the wall, or sometimes a blood red kind of liquid that's congealed on the wall. The reptilians have asserted control over a number of ET groups, and they essentially use these these other beings to do their bidding, because we do reside in a reptilian sphere of influence. A lot of the beings that we commonly call Greys, actually there are factions of Greys, actually do the heavy lifting for the reptilians. They do a lot of the medical procedures. They do a lot of the abducting. And when one follows the forensic trail, if you will, of these people and these abductees and how they're passed from one group of ETs to another within the context of a single abduction experience, oftentimes their interactions with the reptilians is completely wiped clean from their conscious memory. But a skilled regressionist can drudge up the fact that somewhere in this process there were reptilians involved, although often, as I said, they often use Greys and other beings. They work also in consonance, in cooperation with some of the mantis groups. A friend of mine named Diane Johnson is a female MILAB, and she lived in the high desert of Southern California, quite near China Lake Naval Weapons Center. This is in the Ridgecrest area of Southern California, a very infamous place as far as reptilian experiences are concerned, as far as military experiences. There are tremendous underground bases in that whole area of Southern California, in the high desert, the Mojave Desert there. And Diane Johnson was a MILAB. She was told by the military that her particular family has this gland, which has atrophied in most human families. But for whatever reason, it's still active and still is capable of releasing certain hormones. And this particular gland, when released and when controlled by the military controllers and or the ET controllers, can engender psychic abilities within this woman. So Diane Johnson was used, much against her will actually, in remote viewing and other types of operations. One time she was taken on board a craft by the Greys, and there was a ramp that led to the interior of the craft. And next thing you know, the Greys start acting very agitated and becoming very scared. Next thing you know, a large reptilian walked up the ramp, and the Greys manifested extreme fear. The way Diane described it was as if the admiral came onto the ship. And this reptilian was particularly aggravated at the time. And for whatever reason, it lashed out with its claws and ripped open the chest of the nearest Grey entity. And the Grey fell over dead. These reptilians can affect electronics. They can have a ghost in the machine effect. They can mess with people's computers. They can make doorbells ring. They can mimic voices. For example, if you happen to live in a house that has active portal entries, dimensional vortexes, which allow these entities to come and go inside your home. Sometimes they may be coming from a nearby underground base. Sometimes they may be coming from an entirely different dimension. What they can do is mimic the voices of the people living in the home. For example, if the housewife is there alone and she knows that her kids are away at school and she knows that her husband is at work, the reptilians can still mimic the voices of her children and her husband. Mimic the voices and project them out as coming from different parts of the house. So she can go to investigate who's talking, knowing, confused that no one should be home, but she can still clearly hear the voices of the people in her home. They did this to me one time. Me and a colleague of mine used to do what we called reptilian stakeouts. We used to sleep in a bedroom in the high desert of Southern California near Victorville. And it was the children's bedroom where most of the activity took place. There were portals in other parts of the house, but there were active portals in the wardrobe. And the entities would come out of there. Some of them, one of them was like a very tall 6-foot reptilian that stood over me whilst I lay on the ground in a sleeping bag. Me and my colleagues used to flip a coin, right? And whoever won slept in the bed, whoever lost slept on the floor, and we would alternate. And we had another group of friends in the living room. What was interesting was, a lot of it has to do with nervousness too. Me and my friend were making all these jokes, some of them quite ribald. And then after a while, we got tired and went to sleep. Well, what was interesting was the next morning, our colleagues in the living room were telling us, you guys were having a party in there. You were talking and cutting up and laughing all night. But we weren't. We only did that for a short period of time. But what the reptilians did was they mimicked our voices to the T to make them think that we were still awake. And to give an example of the ability of the reptilians to manipulate electronics, here's an example of that. My colleague's the same guy that made up this slide presentation. He's bloodline. In fact, he's descended from the Rothschilds, although I trust him implicitly. And he's had a lot of reptilian experiences. He's lost a couple of girlfriends because on 2 occasions his eyes went vertical and that was the last he saw of them. But anyway, he was very good with gadgets. And what he did was he got this audio bug eavesdropping device, a little bug, and he put an adhesive onto it. And then we tuned the frequency of this scanner, which picks up police transmissions. We tuned it to the frequency emitted by the transmitter in this little bug. And we put it into the wall space right above the entranceway into this children's bedroom. Okay, so here's a door going into the children's bedroom. And right above it, my friend is over 6 foot tall, he put this bug. And then we went inside, closed the door, he tunes into the frequency. No sooner did he tune into the operating frequency that we began to hear heavy breathing. And again, my friend is 6 foot tall. He reached up and he planted that bug up on the wall above the door, at least 6.5, 7 feet in height. So whatever it was had to be at least that height that was breathing into this transmitting device. So my friend and I looked at each other. If you ever see the old Benny Hill show, when like Benny Hill and the little bald guy look at each other, kind of a funny look, that's what happened. And so he decided to take the bold plunge, reached over, opened the door. Nothing there. There's nothing in the hallway. He reached up, grabbed the bug. We went back inside the room. He opened it up, and the innards of the bug was fused. It was fused. So whatever it was had created some kind of power surge that fused the interior of this bug. Another thing I should point out before we go any further is there's a big debate, and a lot of people get agitated when I or one of my colleagues talks about negative experiences, negative entities. I know there are good reptilians. There are whole planets full of good reptilians. People very close to me have been helped by good reptilians. I know they exist. So I'm not here to talk about that. I'm talking about negative reptilians because they're the ones causing the problems. So please keep that in mind. Because of this ability of theirs to alter their density and alter their frequency, they can assume the guise of other ETs, such as Nordics, Palladians, tall grays, even human military or civilian personnel. And there's some overlap there because oftentimes the deep elements of the military aerospace community are working with at least some factions of the reptilians. Not too long ago, a close personal friend of mine had been having reptilian issues as well as being followed by white vans with men in black looking characters. And when they would get out of the van, they would be wearing the archetypal black suits, black slacks, black sunnies, looking very much like Tommy Lee Jones, okay? And what was interesting was my friend had the sudden feeling to look out her balcony. And sure enough, there was a van in front of her house on the street, and there were 3 men in black there. Black suits, black slacks, black sunglasses, military style haircuts. And she took, well, what was interesting was the moment she looked at them and paid attention, they seemed to know that they were under observation. And then they began walking. The van pulled away from the curb and parked further down the street. And 3 of these men in black walked along outside of it. She took 2 photos with her mobile phone camera. Lo and behold, when we looked at the images, we only saw the van. Those men in black types who were standing outside of the, I almost said craft, those 3 guys that were standing outside of the van were not visible in the image, but she clearly saw them. They are masters of frequency and resonance. They can also assume an amorphous black shape. For example, if one, and I'll go into more detail about this, if one were to have an astral dreamscape experience where these reptilian beings, being masters of frequency and resonance, they can enter the body of a sleeping person, especially if that person is themselves, to some degree, a reptilian or Draco-human hybrid, because there is a sympathetic resonance. There's a genetic, indeed spiritual predisposition for these entities to, at least temporarily, form an attachment and or enter into them whilst they sleep. And when they enter into them, they can actually create a stage-managed dream and make the person go through a stage-managed dream that they like direct from beginning to end. And so when a person wakes up from such a stage-managed dream, and oftentimes what happens is, because the frequency of these reptilians, these negative ones, is on the lower, more denser side, sometimes we humans will have a physical reaction which I would liken to like a creepy crawly feeling. From the top of your head down to the tips of your toes, you have this icky, tingly feeling and sensation. Because what's happening is, now that the individual is woken up, the entity is beginning to withdraw out of the body of the sleeping person. And sometimes what happens is, as the reptilian leaves the sleeping person, its energetic form is leaving the sleeping person, the person beneath looking up sees what appears to be like an amorphous black shape, like a black cloud, if you will. But that is the entity itself in the process of leaving the body. And it could hover there for a few minutes or whatever the case may be. Again, not unusual for more than one type of entity to be involved in these experiences. There are people such as David Jacobs and the late Bud Hopkins who would have you believe that there are grays, and only grays. I call it the gray areas of alien abduction research. David Jacobs goes so far as to say that there are no other ETs. There's only grays and the hybrid variance between grays and human beings, and that's utter nonsense. There's a bewildering variety of beings. In a single experience, a person can see several different ETs. And one of my experiences, I saw the reptilian grays, which is a hybrid variant between the grays and the reptilians. And these beings had clawed hands. They didn't have fingers and then fingernails. They just had claws, which the late, great Dr. Carla Turner, the first and foremost protege of Barbara Bartholic, referred to as chicken claws.
There are 2 types of lizard or reptilian kind of beings. When they appear on Earth, they try to do it covertly. Some come from a total different reality, others come from different planets. They all have their own agenda.
When we had EBA 1 in captivity from 1947, 1952, one of the big questions was, do you have a soul? EBA 1 said, absolutely I have a soul. It is eternal.
There are phenomena going on. We also have different life forms, and the Pentagon reports acknowledge that. So when Earth enters a full harmonious level 4 consciousness, those things will appear and they will affect everyone. And we can see that there are some forces on this planet, extraterrestrial forces, that try to ascend humanity faster.
And going back to the whole concept of the resonators and the fact that we are resonators, some of these negative entities, not just reptilians, but some of the grays also, they strive to create pain and anguish, high anxiety, and feelings of hopelessness and paranoia. Like my friend who saw the white van and the three men in black, who we believe were reptilians, and then they didn't show up in the photographs taken by the mobile phone camera. For some people, that would have had like a knockout effect, but my friend and I, we took it in stride. And this is the kind of thing that happens to people like us. We don't feed into it. They're just trying to pull some magical hoochie-coo on us, right? But for some people, that kind of an experience would tend to engender more fear, more paranoia. And that locks them in a feedback loop, which allows these entities to have even more inroads into their physical 3D space. Not only will they strive to create pain and anguish, they will go out of their way in some cases to actually inflict injury upon the person. Lower back problems are very common within a certain segment of the reptilian abductee population, because if the reptilians create some kind of accident or do something to the person, and they can do serious harm during these abductions. I've known people that have had their necks broken and had vertebrae broken intentionally by these beings, just so that they would be in a state of emotional and physical anguish. Being resonators, they'll just lay there on a sofa or on a bed in a feeling of despair, hopelessness, physical, emotional distress, and the entities feed off that. In some cases, they may use energy weapons. Ellis described the case where he felt he was zapped by some kind of energy weapon. They will do that. It's not unusual. Small sample size to be sure, but I've spoken to enough female abductees who've had reptilian experiences that some of them reported being zapped by some kind of energy weapon in their heart center, which resulted in coronary damage. The reptilian concept of human ownership, that's an American politician, also a Bilderberger, noticed the reptilian vertical pupils. Now, Ellis was correct. Not everyone who suddenly manifests vertical pupils or manifests any kind of shape-shifting, and shape-shifting is real. You know, the lore through the ages, people talk about were-lions, werewolves, were-tigers. Shape-shifting is actually quite normal in the greater universe. Operationally, it's an outstanding capability to have, wouldn't it? I'd like to have the capability. I would, that's just me. Because I think it's important at some point to go operational instead of just researching all the time, right? So it should be important to understand that if you see someone shape-shifting, that doesn't mean of necessity they're a reptilian or a Draco hybrid. They could be a feline. And one of my best friends was on Skype with me. I was talking to her. She shape-shifted into a feline being right in front of me. I didn't bat an eyelash. I didn't tell her. But she was, for a moment, she was a full-on feline. And again, due to the genetic predisposition that some people have, because they are essentially, for all intents and purposes, the progeny of this, that, or the other ET race, some people, because they have more DNA of a certain ET race, are more likely to be able to indwell, if you will, these other races. So not only reptilians take people up as host, which I'm going to talk about, but grays can take people up as host. Some people can indwell Nordic beings, Palladian beings, right? So it's a mixed bag. It's not any one thing. There's a lot of misunderstanding about that. Control is exerted through hybrids. Genetic manipulation of the human gene pool and the creation over countless millennia of a hybrid ruling elite is the fundamental basic building block of the reptilian overlordship. Reptilian and Draco human hybrids are to be found in all strata of society, often as not in key influential positions. They can even be like a really negative, psychologically abusive boss or in-law or family member. Because in the grand cosmic chessboard scheme of things, a lot of these beings of the negative variety, they know about us. They know when we're going to incarnate. They know what family we're going to incarnate into. So they move their chips onto the board. They move their pieces onto the board. Oh, you're going to be born into this family. We're going to make sure two of your siblings are raging Draco reptilian hybrids. And they're going to make your childhood miserable, right? Because that's the idea, is to derail the person from an early age, chip away at their self-worth, chip away at their self-esteem, create self-destructive, self-sabotaging behaviors so they start hanging around with bad association. Again, I'm not passing a value judgment on people who do self-destructive, self-sabotaging things, but some people you're better off hanging around with than others, right? And because of self-worth issues, self-esteem issues, we often, like water, always takes the path of least resistance, eventually to be dropped off at its lowest point. A lot of people, due to this manipulation and psychological abuse meted out by reptilian hybrid family members and or friends, I call them matrix sentinels, and they're everywhere. They can affect our personality. They can affect our self-esteem. And that has a knock-on effect throughout our life. Some people wind up becoming people pleasers. Some people go the other way and become psychologically abusive themselves as a means to protect their ego. So in our example, if a person is born into a certain family and that person, let's say, is descended from the Andromedans or the Arcturans or one or more other higher dimensional, spiritually evolved ET races, in true cosmic chess fashion, these negative archontic beings, not just the reptilians again, could be some of the mantis beings and the greys and different factions thereof. It's not just one group of greys. There's a lot of different gray beings that we call greys generically. They will put one of their hybrids or more into your family unit to derail you from the outset. And that's just looking at things from a micro perspective. And I'm going to talk here about the macro perspective and then work back down to the micro. I had a friend, and I met this gal when I was doing the Clyde Lewis show years ago. This is right when Clyde Lewis, I think it's called Ground Zero, his show. He had me on, and he had another friend of mine, Eddie Middleton, on. And we were talking about reptilians and alien abductions. And a gal called in to the show, a listener, and she talked about how her boss was a reptilian. And I knew immediately what she was talking about. She was one of those people that have the ability through, again, these latent metaphysical genetic powers, if you will. Like Ellis, our friend here, this gal has the ability to see the reptilian or Draco or any other entities overshadowing the host human. The host human merely having a genetic spiritual predisposition to have this kind of entity attachment dynamic at work. She told me off the air, because I asked Clyde Lewis, his producer, to get me this woman's phone number, and I did. I called her up, and we had a good friendship, long distance. Long story short, this gal, who I'll call Stacy, worked in a fertility clinic. Very interesting. And again, she can see the entities overshadowing the host human. Her boss, who we call Dr. Talon, and then the two others that were the next highest in the hierarchy, they were reptilians. They were reptilian human hybrids. It was a fertility clinic. And what was interesting was the women that were coming in, they were bringing their ovum in, and they would try to bring these, fertilize these ovum and then reimplant them in these women, and then hopefully they would be viable, and then they would bear children. She told me that the success rate was appalling, but the staff didn't care. 30-40% of the time or less, these women would give birth. What was interesting was, she said, virtually all of the women who came to this fertility clinic, and this fertility clinic was just one of many, she described them as tall, blonde, blue-eyed, Nordic in appearance. I mean, hello, where have I heard that before, right? Tall, blonde, Nordic, blue-eyed in appearance. Very interesting. And then we started delving into it more. It turns out that the donors all all turned out to be, or with few exceptions, people males that we would regard as having some professional credibility in our society. Mathematicians, scientists, doctors, engineers, attorneys, so on and so forth. Stacy used to go to these symposiums. They were like yearly symposiums. They'd meet somewhere in California somewhere, and it would be like a 3-day event. And the leaders of the fertility industry in America would give presentations, would give white papers, essentially setting the agenda for the fertility industry for the next year, next 5 years, et cetera, et cetera. Penny, because of her ability to see the entities overshadowing the host human, said fully 60% of the presenters, the leading lights of the fertility industry, were all reptilians. 60% at least, well, not all, but 60% were reptilians. So that was an interesting dynamic. This is exactly what a lot of people like David Icke have been talking about, the hybridization of the human race between reptilians and vice versa, the cross-fertilization, if you will. Now, there are basically two types of ways that hybrids can be created. One is the old-fashioned way, similar to how, like a dog breeder would adroitly mix and match and pair up the two lines of males and females. But what the reptilians would do is, by hook and crook, they would manipulate things through these bloodlines they're tracking, and they would, my colleague, and Barbara Barthick was a pioneer in this, talking about the drama of the love obsession, the bonding of two people who've been alien abductees and abducted since childhood, put together periodically over time to develop this emotional, energetic bond, and then magically they meet like at a UFO lecture as adults, and then they have this super chemical attraction to one another, et cetera, et cetera. Nowadays, people refer to it as the alien love bite. It's just one example of the ability of these beings to manipulate people and affect in a way that advances their agenda interpersonal human relationships. They can match people up. They can pair people up. In our example, let's say the woman was paired up with somebody. The woman has a lot of reptilian DNA in her bloodline. The male she's paired up with has a lot of reptilian DNA in his bloodline. And then they have offspring. And what the reptilians can do is they can begin medically, genetically, if you will, turning those people more reptilian, if you will, from the inside out. I've known people, reptilian human abductees, who were being medically experimented on virtually every night, where they would wake up with marks all over their body. It happened time and time and time and time again, to the point where they were being turned into a reptilian inside out. Portals and interdimensional travel. This wound up in my lab buddy's photo album in his mobile phone. He didn't take the picture, it just wound up there. If I didn't know any better, I think it's showing a portal opening and some entity wearing a hat on the other side. Maybe, maybe not, but interesting that photo showed up in his photo album. The same guy, in fact, this is the guy who made this video presentation. That's what happened to him. One night he was laying in his bed. He looked up above his headboard, and looking down at him over the headboard was these three reptilians. They created a portal entry. He intuited that the smaller being in the middle, and sometimes reptilians show up in threes for whatever reason. The smaller one was a female. And again, this is the guy who's descended from the Rothschilds. And it was dark, but he could perceive what appeared to be a city with lights in the distance behind them. So I'm guessing that they opened up this portal and they were looking at him because they regard him as their progeny, their descendant, if you will. And because of the time-space distortion, he's able to look behind them and see what appears to be some underground city in the back, some distance away. Again, this is right above his headboard. His bed is here, his headboard is here, and that portal was open, and they're looking down at him right there. That's my friend laying there. She showed up on a a TV mystery show in America called Monsters and Mysteries in America. They wanted me to be a consultant, but I don't have anything to do with corporate media. I routinely knock back any request from Discovery Channel and et cetera, to appear on their mockumentaries. I want no part. Unfortunately, in this instance, they went and got some guy who's a debunker, basically, to take my place. But anyway, my friend was laying there in bed, and these two, what appeared to be tall grays, appeared before her. And this is a gal who has reptilian and military experiences. In fact, she's the one that after the reptilian raped her, she was teleported to the military base underground and was tasked with remote viewing. She could see behind the black eyepieces because that's what they are. They're black eyepieces. They're not real eyes. She could see the vertical pupils behind the black eyepieces. So they're either like this tall gray reptilian variant or reptilians themselves that are pretending to be tall grays. We call these beings baby Godzillas because look at them, right? And the one on the right has a wand. Now, my friend, who you just saw in the previous sketch, she was openly questioning her sanity. See, I never did because I know my own mind. I know when I have my own thoughts, and I know when some weird thought enters the fray that probably is not my thought. These beings are very tricky. They insinuate their thoughts into our head, but they use their own thought voice. She was going through this mental process of, I must be going crazy, this can't be real. The very next morning, these two immature reptoids showed up in her kitchen, and the one on the right held up this wand, aimed it at her, activated it, and she began levitating. And she was floating about 6 feet off the floor in a horizontal position, as if to say, do you think you're imagining this? Do you think this is real, or do you think you're going crazy, right? And I had a run-in with those little guys, too. They're probably a lot bigger now. When I was sleeping, me and the guy that made this video presentation, on this particular night, I was sleeping on the bed. He was on the floor. Now, if you were to look at the wardrobe, the closet, it would be jam-packed with a clothes hamper, with hangers, with throw rugs. It was jam-packed. There was no room for it, anything in the physical sense. But nevertheless, because these beings have the ability to alter their density, they can come in and out. I took photos with an old-fashioned Polaroid of that wardrobe, and I submitted the wardrobe, the photos, to Bob Brown, the late founder of the International UFO Congress in America, because Bob Brown was in contact with a former Defense Intelligence Agency remote viewer and a very gifted psychic. So I mailed the photos off to Bob Brown, and he passed on the photos to this former DIA remote viewer, and immediately this woman, the former remote viewer, identified an energetic source at the bottom, at the back of the wardrobe at the bottom. And she intuited immediately and saw in her third eye mystical vision entities coming in and out, right? So, and we already knew that, but it was a nice confirmation. So one morning rather, I'm laying there in the bed, and the sun is just starting to rise. The window was here, the light's starting to come in, and then I start to hear sounds from the closet, right? So I sat up, and then bop, bop, on my left and my right cheek, I was punched, and I blacked out. It was one of those things. It was one of those little immature reptoids that punched me out. I mean, at least he didn't scratch me, but he punched me out, and for weeks I had pain on both my cheeks. What's interesting also was when the lady of the house stepped on one of those immature reptoids when she was walking down her hallway. It scurried out of her bathroom, and she stepped on its tail. She said it squealed and it sounded like a pig. This was drawn by the son of a former colleague of mine. The colleague was the guy who ran the avionics of Naval Aviation Depot in San Diego. He's a buddy of mine I've since lost contact with. He did the avionics for the FA-18 Hornets and the E-2 Charlie airborne warning control aircraft, the Navy variant of the AWACS. Anyway, that's his son's drawing. And this is a reptilian. It was short. It had a cape. It had a utility belt. We often hear about Facebook being data mining. Well, here's my little nugget right here. I've been hearing about these reptoids or reptilians. I'm wondering where I can read more on these beings. And Whitley Strieber says, Google reptilians, but don't expect any proof that they exist. Well, I've just spent 2 hours telling you about reptilians. And everything I've told you has come from actual people who've had encounters with them. What constitutes proof? Is it something tangible or is it intangible? I think that people that actually go through these experiences are tangible proof that what's happening, what's being described is real. Well, I want to thank you, and here's the good, feel-good message I promise you at the outset. The fundamental concepts are changing. The frequencies of this earth, including the Schumann resonance, have been documented, have been increasing. There were articles coming out in mainstream science magazines and mainstream science websites talking about how mainstream physicists were freaking out because normally stable elements, such as carbon-14, and we are carbon-based units, to use a Star Trek term, how even stable elements like carbon-14 are exhibiting more rapid decay. In other words, we're becoming more energetic. Now, of course, the physicists, being reductionists, they attribute it to some woo-woo particle coming out of the sun. No, I believe it's the entire plane that's rising in frequency, because everything is one, everything is connected. So as time goes on, everything I see the reptilian overlords and their hybrid minions doing on this planet is an act of desperation. But they can't stop this frequency increase. So for those of us who are so inclined who willingly want to literally raise our frequency, because within the genetic profile of many of you here, perhaps even all of you, you are descended from higher dimensional, spiritually evolved, and extended star family. You are boots on the ground. You are ground crew. You are here to anchor higher frequencies. You could have been anywhere today, but you chose to be here. And as time goes on, our operating frequency bandwidth is increasing, theirs is narrowing. That's why they're pulling out all the stops. That's good news. But people have to watch out about the GMOs and the vaccines. Thanks, Ben. Because there are ramifications, not just for one's health and longevity in this life, but also the potential for them to be recycled again. Because there is this ongoing soul harvesting, soul recycling agenda that has been at work for countless millennia. That's why so many of us, we don't reincarnate on other planets, even if we have come from another star system or star systems in the past. But again, many of you are ground crew. You've had experiences with not just negative beings, but you've had experiences with positive beings, with feline beings, with Pleiadians, with Andromedan beings, and even good reptilian beings, good Manus beings. They do exist. It's a big, wide multiverse. So you are the sum of all your parts. All of the past lives that you've had on this planet and on other planets, and your counterparts who are actual aspects of yourselves that coexist in other timelines and in higher dimensions. The timelines are starting to merge, and so you're starting to reintegrate. Some of you are noticing that the lag between the query going out, the intention going out, the desire coming out, and the multiverse responding in kind. You're noticing that the time lag is decreasing. You're beginning to manifest more and more. That's good news. So there's nothing to be afraid of. We are immortal beings in physical embodiment. And we've chosen to be here at this time. So I applaud all of you. I'm humbled and I'm honored to be in your presence because you're spiritual warriors who decided to make a difference and stand in the gap. So thank you. I really appreciate your patience. I shared a lot of information. And one last thing, Chris Turner, outstanding conference, and I really do hope that we make it a regular yearly gig. So thank you, everybody.
Thanks,